So we've been talking about ACEs lately a lot, and we've mostly stuck with the ones that are on the official test, but I've been getting a lot of questions and comments about, what about this experience? Isn't this an ACE? So just to be clear, any adverse experience that causes separation is a trauma and therefore counts as an ACE. Just because it didn't make the official ACE test doesn't mean it doesn't count, or didn't cause adverse experiences and effects in your life. So that's what we're going to be talking about in today's video, the ACEs that didn't make the official ACE test. Stay tuned. If you're new to the channel or haven't yet joined this awesome community all about emotional and financial well-being of women and children, do that now before we get started. Just click the little red subscribe button and the bell beside it to be notified every time that we release a new video. The official ACE test, which was created by Kaiser Permanente and the CDC, only included the 10 most common ACEs. And the reason for that is, at the time, they were just kind of trying to get a sample of how bad things were. They kind of had these theories about how trauma affects a person for their lifetime. But what they found was so startling that it has opened up a much larger investigation the last 25 years since the first test was conducted on a group of mostly white, highly educated, upper-class San Diegans. Surprisingly, even Oprah Winfrey just heard about it a couple years ago, and she was so riveted by what she learned, she named it one of the most important topics that she's ever covered in over 30 years of doing talk shows. It's also been named the #1 unaddressed public health crisis facing Americans by several major health organizations. I talked more about it in this video, but basically, what happens to a person in childhood affects them the rest of their lives. For those new to the term, ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, are the things that happen to us before we were old enough to do anything about them. These things can even begin in the womb, and then as more and more negative experiences occur, there's a compounding effect in the child's life that then gets carried into adulthood and even affects that person's longevity by an average of 20 years. I've discussed this in several of my other videos, so I'll make sure to put links in the description at the end in case you're just hearing the term for the first time or want to learn more about them. But today we're going to be talking about the ACEs that weren't included on the official ACE test. Because like I said earlier, just because they weren't the most common doesn't mean they were any less damaging. Due to time restrictions, I'm going to be briefly going over about 10 or 11 of these, and then at the end I'll give a list of the rest of them and also some links to articles that go into greater depth. I just mentioned how ACEs can happen even when a child is still in his or her mother's womb. How? Well, the amount of stress a mother is exposed to while carrying her unborn child directly affects the baby. Every time a pregnant mother goes into a state of fight or flight during her pregnancy, her body releases stress hormones, and then those hormones cross the placenta. So if this is ongoing, the unborn baby comes to see stress or stress hormones as normal. Studies have shown that the more active the unborn baby is, the more likely it is that the mother has excessive stress. Pregnant mothers who have their own ACE scores from childhood tend to be more stressed, but they're also more likely to be in stressful interpersonal relationships and environments. Another effect that this has on the unborn baby is that genes get switched on and off according to the amount of stress that a mother carries. This is called epigenetics. I'm not going to go into great detail today, but we're going to be doing a future video all about epigenetics. The next ACE that a child can experience, and in my opinion this is the most common and most important ACE of them all, is called attachment trauma. This one happens during the first 3 years of life. And just like during pregnancy, the amount of stress a mother carries is the most influential factor. 3 of the most important components of secure attachment are attunement, co-regulation, and nurture. A stressed out mom has it difficult providing those even for herself, let alone her new infant. And this is usually because she's so wrapped up in her own cares and concerns because life is throwing all sorts of adversity her way. So it makes it very difficult to create a safe and secure environment for her infant to thrive in. Another key component during those first 3 years is the amount and or nature of separation between the mother and the child. Attachment is a very delicate process that requires almost constant contact between mother and child during the first 3 years. So if you were often separated or even completely separated from your mother during the first 3 years, it's very possible that this affected your ability to securely attach. There have even been studies that have shed negative light on the effects daycare can have on forming a secure attachment. And this is just because secure attachment requires the mother to be the constant in the baby's world. Obviously, daycare is unavoidable sometimes, and there are mothers who are in a position where they're forced to separate from their babies just so they can provide a living. So this is not to point fingers of blame at our mothers, but just to highlight a crucial aspect of development. But when the components I just mentioned, stress and separation, are frequently present, the child will often form anxious, ambivalent, avoidant, or disorganized attachments with the mother, which adversely sets the stage for all other life experiences. Because the way that we learn to relate to and attach with our caregivers is the way we're going to tend to relate and attach in future relationships. We'll be talking more about attachment in future videos, but for now, let's move on to the next ACE on the list. Domestic violence in the home is on the official ACE test and denotes physical violence in the home, especially toward the mother. However, frequent family conflict can be just as damaging to a young child as domestic violence is because it sends them the same basic message that my environment isn't safe. Therefore, witnessing emotional violence is just as damaging to a child's development as witnessing physical violence. Another adverse experience a child can have is inconsistent parenting, which is just what the name implies. Parenting in an inconsistent manner where the child doesn't know what to expect from minute to minute or day to day because things change according to the parent's mood or circumstance. One minute, the parent might be playful and kind, and the next they might be harsh and distant. And that switch usually happens below the child's radar, so it's very startling when they take the same action but get a different response. If this happens in the first 3 years, it can lead to disorganized attachment. Whereas if it happens later in childhood, it can lead to confusion that then causes adaptations such as lack of trust in others, lack of trust in self, hypervigilance, people-pleasing, and a difficulty regulating. Social isolation is actually something I can speak to personally because it's one of the ACEs that I went through. And I understand that sometimes social isolation is just a natural byproduct of parental self-isolation. But in other situations, in other cases, a parent will purposely isolate his child because he's afraid of the influences from outside. Talk about hypocrisy, but that's another story for another time. In my case, we were on a college campus for the first 2 years of my life, so I had plenty of people around, plenty of kids to play with. But then we moved to another state with lots of acreage, so I was essentially isolated, and the only time I would see people my age or anyone was when we went to the store and to church service on Sunday morning. And I did have siblings, but that didn't quite take care of that need for peer socialization in me. So the only other time I would see people during the year is when we would have family visit 3 times or whatever from out of state. So that was a highlight of my life. So the 3, 4, and 5, I was pretty isolated and didn't have a lot of socialization. And so when I entered kindergarten, it was so awkward because not only was I dealing with social isolation, but I also had other ACEs. Like I had domestic violence in the home. I had a mental illness of a caregiver. I had neglect. I had attachment trauma. So by the time I was 5, entering kindergarten, my self-esteem was so low. And I'm telling you, I now know that if a child's self-esteem is already low by the age of 5, it is directly due to parenting. And I'm sorry if that sounds harsh, but that is the reality. So I entered kindergarten and I just felt so shy and introverted, which is not my authentic nature. I love to be around people and I love to converse and meet new people and socialize. So social isolation is a very damaging aspect of raising a child. Neighborhood violence or witnessing or victimization of violence outside the home, shootings, stabbings, talk about adaptations for a person who is in ever-present danger of being shot or stabbed or robbed or raped. This person is in survival mode for his or her very own life a lot of the times. And it often goes hand in hand with being in a low-income neighborhood. Children coming from environments like this tend to have the very highest ACE scores and often have major life effects and even die much younger than the average person with significant ACEs. Bullying has much longer lasting effects than was previously realized. I still see adults in their 50s and 60s trying to overcome the social scene they faced when they were in middle or high school. They could be the most beautiful, brightest, most intelligent, successful people, but if they were bullied when they were young and in the developmental stage, oftentimes their self-esteem is much lower than it should be. I do think that conditions in infancy and childhood can set a person up to be more likely to be bullied, but overall, there is no one automatically exempt from this. It happens to people from all ethnicities, social classes, and religions. Bullies themselves have some very specific traits, and these are caused by childhood dysfunction, which is directly linked to parenting. I've never seen an exception to this. Bullies have emotional deficiencies that make them feel like they have to demoralize another person in order to feel more powerful themselves or in control of the situation. I know society has done a lot to try to stop bullying in schools, but the problem still remains, which lets us know that we're not getting to the root problem, which is the emotional aspects of parenting, whether that be dysfunctional attachment, emotional neglect, emotional abuse, or a combination of the three. Living in foster care or other out-of-home placement is probably the one ACE that I get asked about the most often. And it is really common, but I think the reason that they didn't put it on the official ACE test is because it falls silently under physical neglect, emotional neglect, and also loss of parent. But foster care in and of itself can cause its own problems. For example, if you're moved from one home to the next, which a lot of foster kids are, you learn that nothing is stable and no one is for sure going to be there in your life. So it breeds trust issues. It causes you to form many adaptations just to survive that emotionally. It can introduce the deep pathological feeling of loneliness even when surrounded by people. The child essentially loses their sense of belonging because they're never in a stable place where this is always going to be my home. And it also can introduce the pathological feelings of rejection and abandonment, which then get carried into adult relationships. Discrimination has been a hot topic as of late, but honestly, it's been an issue ever since the dawn of man. The nature of discrimination, the root cause, is actually very similar to that of bullying. There's an intrinsic fragility or deficiency on the part of the discriminator, a weakness or insecurity inside of them that makes them feel the need to disempower or demoralize another person, whether that be a person of a different gender, race, ethnicity, or culture. When discrimination happens in childhood, whether that be toward the child or by the parents of the child toward others, or another aspect of the child's environment, not only does this perpetrate discrimination by standard modeling, but it sends a message that either the child himself or those who are not like him are either inferior or superior to him. Even if this happens on a subconscious level, meaning the child isn't directly exposed to it, it can have very damaging effects. Another type of abuse that I can personally speak to is spiritual abuse. And spiritual abuse is just where a parent indoctrinates their child with their belief system using methods of fear. And this has a huge range. I mean, it can be something very mild, like talking about, oh, when you die, you might go to hell, all the way to the scary, scary rituals of some other pagan religion. In my situation, I could tell my parents were coming from a good place with it, but it was still very damaging and had negative effects on my perception of who God was. So even though they were coming from a great place and they were trying to protect me and they were trying to teach me something that they 100% believed in, the way they did it scared me to the point that I remember having some conversations with my dad where I would have physiological effects of fear because of what he was saying. And what I went through is mild in comparison to what some children go through. Ritualistic sacrifices of animals, witchcraft, seances, polygamy, satanic ceremonies, killing in the name of a deity. And on and on. There are so many forms of religious and spiritual abuse. And actually, with polygamy, I believe it is both spiritual and sexual abuse combined, but that's a whole nother video, and probably one I won't be making for a very long time because it disgusts me on so many levels. Incarceration of a parent is listed on the official ACE test, but has anyone ever considered how traumatizing the arrest of the parent actually is? Just that 1 hour alone, to me, can be worse than even the incarceration itself, and definitely counts as an ACE. Watching your parent be accosted, especially if the parent was resisting, handcuffed, put in the police car, etc., everything that goes on in a violent arrest. To me, that can be more acutely traumatizing than the incarceration itself because it provokes fear, whereas incarceration is more likely to bring feelings of sadness and loneliness and loss, which are still damaging, but to me, no worse than watching an arrest. Adoption can be the most beautiful thing in the world and often gives a child a second chance at life. But there are many times, and this isn't talked about often because of the pain it brings all parties involved, but adoption doesn't always go the way everyone thought it would. And the word that comes to mind here, where adoption can leave holes in the child's life, is attachment trauma. Whether the child is 3 days old, 3 years old, or even 13, what happens before an adoption takes place is that the child is separated from the birth mother, which is an attachment trauma of some kind. It has varying effects on the child, of course. Like some children are way more affected by it than others, but it is naturally an attachment trauma. And this is not to say that the child would have been better off staying with the birth mother. I mean, by all means, that's not true. But the fact that does remain is that separation is an ACE because it causes attachment trauma in the child. A truly loving and nurturing family is able to overcome the effects of this negative effect in the child's life, and many, many have. I mean, adoption can be a wonderful thing. And so many children are grateful that someone decided that they wanted to have them as their child. But I'm talking about the situations where the child never is able to get over the attachment trauma, and for whatever reason, the adoptive parents aren't able to breach that gap. So because they started out with attachment trauma, it just has compounding effects the rest of their lives. Personally, I know several people who have wonderful adoption stories, but unfortunately, I know just as many who don't. Another ACE that's kind of related to adoption is forming stepfamilies, but we're not going to go into detail about that today because I'm going to actually be doing a complete video about forming stepfamilies down the road in probably a few weeks, just because it deserves to have its own space to be able to talk about all the different things that can happen in those scenarios. A few of the other ACEs not listed on the official ACE test are frequently hearing of death in the community, losing a best friend or a close friend or even a classmate, major childhood illness, house fires, loss of pet, moving several times throughout your childhood, military deployment of a parent, especially if that's frequent, economic hardship, homelessness, loss of a sibling through death or other separation. And I know we didn't have time to cover these in detail today, but what I plan to do is make another video, like a part 2, so that we can go into some depth with each of these. And if you can think of another ACE that's not on the test, make sure to put it in the comments so I can include it in that video when I do make it. And make sure your notifications are turned on if you want to hear us talk a little bit more about some of these. Suffice it to say, there are dozens of these ACEs that weren't on the official test. Just because you possibly didn't experience one of the most common doesn't mean you weren't negatively affected during the developmental years. For most of us, we had a combination of ACEs that were on the test and some that weren't. ACEs set a person up for a lifetime of struggles as the effects compound as life continues. This pyramid chart shows how one effect can lead to the next, that leads to the next. And sadly, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, if a person with ACEs doesn't go through trauma-informed therapy, not only do they experience many very difficult things throughout life, they die an average of 20 years younger than someone who doesn't have ACEs. If you feel like your life has been negatively impacted by ACEs, there is hope for recovery. I did an entire series on the topic just a few months ago, so I'm going to put a link to that in the description for you. That way, if you want to get started on healing and recovery today, you can. We can't do anything about the things that happened to us and around us when we were children, but we can do something about the negative effects we now face as a result. ACEs affect everything from health to finances to relationships, to parenting, to a general sense of well-being, etc. Time does not heal all wounds, so it's necessary to engage in a process of healing in order to overcome all the negative impact your ACEs have had on your life. Next week, we're going to be going into a little bit more detail about trauma-informed therapy and discuss a couple of the success stories that people have had after going through it. It is possible to start living the best version of your life today, even if you're already in your 40s, 50s, 60s, or beyond. I just don't want this video to be discouraging, but a source of hope instead. Step 1 is awareness. Learning what ACEs are and how they affect you is the key to being able to heal from them. Hopefully you found the information we discussed today useful, and if you did, please consider giving the video a like to help others find it, or leave a comment below. And also feel free to ask questions there, especially if I didn't quite complete talking about something or I left something hanging. I'd also love to connect with you on social media, so feel free to message me or comment on my page, Leah Theobald. I'll make sure to put a link in the description so it's easy to find. Thanks for tuning in with me today. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.